Welcome to Molden and Schmidt, the podcast which explores the big questions about the future of motoring and, crucially, how to make it more sustainable. Today, we're very pleased to have a special guest, John McElroy, joining us from the US. John is president of Blue Sky Productions, which produces Autoline, which is in many forms, including a daily webcast, weekly TV, many others. He's one of the most well-known, respected commentators on the automotive industry. So, John, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, and good to see you, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you, John. Haven't seen you in a while. I guess the latest we did was our podcast or our Autoline After Hours about 3 years ago.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right. And Oliver Schmidt joins us as usual. Oliver, briefly introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, I guess people know me by now, but I'll do it again. So my name is Oliver Schmidt. I've been working for about 25 years in the automotive industry, but of course, most people know me from my involvement in the Volkswagen Dieselgate, or maybe because they have seen me on some episode of Autoline After Hours.
That's exactly right. Oliver was one of the guests on the show. He always had great things to say. And, the emissions scandal thing in the past, we're moving forward now.
Okay.
Well, I will actually, before we actually move forward, I wanted to start by asking a cheeky question and full in the knowledge that Oliver is right in front of me, which is, and John, this question to you is, we're obviously in a situation now where authorities are pushing electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles. China has stolen a march. It's developed a lot of competitive advantage. Would we be in anything like this situation if it hadn't been for Dieselgate? Is electric vehicles an artifact of Dieselgate? Would we be on some completely different path if it hadn't been for Dieselgate, or was it all going this way anyway? What do you think?
I think it was going this way anyway, because, there's global concern about global warming. There's a sense of emergency that things have got to be done about it. In fact, I've just read today that yesterday was the hottest day ever recorded for planet Earth, and the day before that was a prior record. So there was always going to be this pressure to do something about carbon emissions in the transportation sector. But I will say Dieselgate amplified that. It really convinced environmentalists we had to get away from internal combustion engines and go electric. So I think we'd still be pretty much on the same path, but Dieselgate really brought a lot of things forward.
When I meet people now that I know from former times, they always blame me for being the one that killed the internal combustion engine. But I don't like that title that much. But you're right, John. I think we were all on the path towards electricity because of the California ZEV mandate and getting more stringent CO2 targets that you only can meet with a mixture of electric vehicles and internal combustion engines. So the path was already paved. But I think Dieselgate was something that accelerated this. And I think in some regions, it even accelerated too fast. And now you see a drop in sales on electric vehicle in certain states, like here where I live in Germany. I've seen in the US, it's picking up pretty big at the moment. But here in Germany, because of the cancellation of tax subsidies, it dropped a bit, the sales. So, but I guess, it was a catalyst for it. Yeah.
So the next question I want to ask, John, is you've written a lot elsewhere, highlighting the Chinese advantage at the moment, so 30 to 35% cost advantage, and saying for the US auto industry to have a good long-term future, it needs to get down to similar levels. Firstly, is it all about cost, or is it also about the sort of fundamental competitive advantage rather than just straight cost cutting? My view has always been the US and Europe has had a fundamental competitive advantage in building internal combustion engines, which China never really cracked. So in a sense, China decided to leapfrog to another technology in which it could build a competitive advantage. So for the long term, is it sufficient for the US to just cut its costs, or does it actually need to create a new competitive advantage? And if so, what could that competitive advantage be? What can the Chinese not copy?
Superb question, Nick. But first of all, even though you're right, I did this column video about how the Detroit area has got to get competitive with the Chinese. But it equally applies to Europe. It applies to Japan. It applies to Korea. I concentrated on the Detroit area because I live in the Detroit area, and I'm trying to light a fire and get these companies, automakers and suppliers, and in fact, the whole political arena to get more competitive. Chinese have a substantial cost advantage, but they also have really good intellectual property. I mean, they dominate the whole EV side of things. When it comes to software, they're extremely good at that. They're bleeding edge when it comes to product development, at least the speed of product development. Their user interfaces on the interiors of their cars are the best in the world right now. So just getting cost competitive with the Chinese is not enough. It's got to be technically, or any of the, I'll say Western, but I'm going to throw Japan and South Korea in. And when I say Western, it's up to the Western companies not to take the Chinese threat seriously. And but it starts with cost. Look, if the Chinese had the same cost as the U.S., Europe, Japan, and South Korea, their road ahead would be far, far more difficult. But in point of fact, they have a substantial cost advantage. And, time is of the essence. You can't wait to the next decade to get competitive. You have to start doing things drastically now on the product that is design cost out of the car. And that's the key. You have to design it out. Same with the process, the manufacturing process. And I would argue even the organizational structure of these companies is suited for the 20th century, not the 21st century, and certainly not this part of the 21st century that we're in right now. So it's going to be a daunting task.
Out of the 35% cost advantage for China, how much of this percentage you think is subsidized by the Chinese government?
A huge amount, no question about it. They have access to low-cost loans. They have access to subsidies.
Okay.
They have a market that has now turned to consumers who, pre-COVID, preferred foreign brands, largely European brands, to domestic Chinese ones. That's completely flipped right now. The Chinese consumer perceives that the Chinese brands offer the best technology and price. So there's no question that government subsidies are playing a big role in the Chinese advantage. But Oliver, I remember back in the 1980s when the Japanese were kicking Detroit's ass. And everybody in town here was, wringing their hands and saying, oh my gosh, we have such a currency disparity. The dollar is so strong versus the yen. The Japanese have a protected market. They have a government that's working in concert to compete against us. We have no chance of competing. And then when they started to finally study the situation and see the Toyota production system that is so lean, and when they started getting lean themselves, they got competitive. And so my argument is same thing with the Chinese. You can cry all day long about all these subsidies, but you can't do anything about it. But you can do things about designing cost out of your product, out of your process, and out of your organizational structure. So to stop wasting all your time complaining about things you have no control over and start working on the things that you do have control on.
But doesn't this, John, only work if the US can build its own battery supply chain? Otherwise, the single biggest component will always be in the hands of the Chinese, and they will have a substantial degree of control as to how much they would charge American manufacturers. So you wouldn't be able to achieve that price competitiveness unless you had that supply chain. Do you think that's a correct characterization? And if so, does the US have a chance of building those supply chains?
Yeah, no, you're spot on with what you're saying. I absolutely do believe that the U.S. can be competitive and develop its own supply chain. It's going to take a number of years to do that, but there's a national security component to this that goes beyond the automotive industry. If you look at lithium batteries today, whatever kind of chemistry that you want to talk about, they're used in so much military and aerospace and other aspects. So a stat that I like to cite to anti-EV people in the United States is when the U.S. military drops our warfighters into a combat zone, each one of our warfighters has 18 pounds of batteries as part of their kit, as part of their gear, for night vision systems, communication, and things like that. Where do you think most of those batteries come from? So they come from China. And if they don't come from China, the materials that were made, used to make them, were processed in China. So it's a matter of national security, not just, automotive competitiveness, that the U.S. has got to develop its own supply chain. I would argue the same for Europe and Japan and South Korea.
So which battery component do you see the most important to find locally? If we talk chemistry now, so we have these lithium batteries. So what's the chemistry that you think is the most important to find locally? We know we have lithium. Lithium you can get out of water in some areas. They just started this huge production facility down here in Hungary. They are now supposed to, Serbia, I think. Serbia it is, sorry. They now are supposed to supply the whole European industry. We know we have huge amounts of lithium here in the water in Germany. So I think you can solve. But what about the cobalt? Where do you get that from?
Yeah, look, where everybody seems to be going right now is to lithium iron phosphate, which has zero cobalt in it.
Okay.
And they're not as efficient, but they're much cheaper. They are not as affected in cold weather. They can take multiple deep discharges and charges. And so that seems to be the focus right now is a move to lithium iron phosphate.
Okay.
There's other promising technologies with sulfur and other materials too. So just as cobalt is a politically sensitive material, same goes for rare earth minerals, an area that China also dominates, not for batteries, but for electric motors. And now you see a move to more and more companies developing, copper round motors, not permanent magnet ones. Yeah. And it's all about trying to get a secure supply chain.
Inherent in that supply chain as well, in my view, is the energy cost in producing these batteries. It's all very well. You can create the supply chain in terms of, do we have these materials under the ground? Can we extract lithium from wherever? But there's a huge amount of energy required to do that. So the other necessary factor is to have access to cheap energy. And that's where, in my view, Europe is in a particularly weak spot. So looking at it from the US, do you see that Europe has any chance at all of developing its own supply chains locally of any significance? I mean, the Serbian one, my view, may well be one exception. But can you see that Europe can do that? Or will Europe effectively be either dependent on China or the US in the medium to long term for those battery materials based on that energy dimension?
Real tough situation for Europe. Look, China's all in. They've been all in for 20 years, really. That's when they first started putting their strategy together. The U.S. is trying to play catch up right now, largely through the IRA, what they call the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of a stupid name. It really was an industrial policy, and it's pouring billions of dollars into developing a supply chain either within the U.S. or with U.S. allies. And I think Europe is going to have to do something similar. I don't think the marketplace is going to produce an answer quickly enough for Europe to be able to compete with the Americans and the Chinese in this regard. It needs its own IRA. It's going to take substantial amounts of money to pull this off.
Yeah, okay, there we face the problem of the European system. So Europe is not one country like the US is. So we have this European Parliament, but we all know they always have to have one vote. The majority vote there doesn't count. So that's a tough challenge for Europe that you are describing there.
It is, but don't paint the U.S. as so monolithic. I mean, the IRA was a massive political fight. It was the right place at the right time for it to get enacted. If Trump gets reelected this fall, all bets are off with what's going on with electric vehicles. So the good news is so much money has already been committed, and not just government money. The government money opened up a flood of private investment as people are rushing in to take advantage of this. But Europe needs to do something similar, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you think, I mean, on this podcast, we're particularly interested in whether these innovations actually lead to emissions reduction or not. What's striking for the whole debate from my point of view is there's been a very effective conflation of the idea of CO2 reduction and EV penetration. And my view is they're not one and the same thing. Do you think therefore, do you think there's any risk that we invest these tens of billions of dollars, we maybe successfully do create an EV industry, which is great for jobs, but actually doesn't address the underlying emissions issue because the energy is too dirty or whatever? So could it all be in vain in the end? Or do you think that is an overblown
Yeah, I'm not worried about that. And I'll tell you why, Nick. There's no question that EVs and battery manufacturing create a huge carbon footprint. So an EV rolls off the assembly line with a substantially larger CO2 footprint than an internal combustion engine vehicle. But they quickly make up the difference. The studies that I've seen say that a typical American vehicle, let's call it a Ford F-150 pickup, is cleaner than its electric counterpart up to about 25,000 miles of driving. After that, the EV becomes cleaner, and the vehicle is going to be driven for a minimum of 200,000 miles. So from 0 to 25,000, it's dirtier. After that, it's cleaner. For a mid-size passenger car, it's about 20,000 miles. The ICE is cleaner than the EV for the first 20,000 miles. After that, the EV is cleaner. And that's what today's amount of development. There's a lot of work on reducing the amount of energy that especially goes into making batteries. The industry is only going to get better and better at this. What I would say, where I would agree with where I think you're going with this, is most of the public is not ready for an EV. So it would make a lot of sense to get them into hybrids or maybe even plug-in hybrids / EREVs, extended range EVs, because the public seems to be more willing to deal with that. So where they don't have range anxiety, they don't have plug-in anxiety, charging time anxiety, any of that stuff. And so that could get us to a lower carbon world faster than trying to shove everybody into EVs. Yeah. When you live for a while, they're just not ready for it.
Talking about hybrids and everything, what's your take on synthetic fuels?
Synthetic fuels are the main goal for the internal combustion people, right? Because internal combustion engines don't generate carbon. It's the carbon in the fuel that generates the carbon. So if you can take the carbon out of the fuel, we can run internal combustion engines for the rest of the century with no problem. I don't think that's going to happen. Because I think we're going to go electric anyway. It's just far more efficient. Oliver, you know better than anyone. Yeah. The internal combustion engine, thermodynamic efficiency is horrible. Horrible. It's really bad. We waste half the energy in every gallon or liter of petrol or diesel.
Make it 2/3, John.
Okay, 2/3, yes. I'm talking about Formula One engines, which were cost is almost no electric, and they throw all the technology in the room.
Okay.
51% thermally efficient. But in any case, I think that the low carbon or zero carbon fuels are not going to come in the volume in time or at the price in time. And they're trying to chase a moving target. EVs just keep getting better and better and better. Every generation is just getting better. Who knows? Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I just don't see synthetic fuels being available in the volume that's needed at the price that's needed.
And there's also the topic that the synthetic fuel we should use there where we can't replace the ICE. So like planes. Or ships or whatever. So this. I don't want to go back to sailboats like in the 1800s. So I guess that we will still see the most of the usage of those synthetic fuels, whatever they are. I think they should be used in planes and ships, because it's not that easy to convert those.
Right, I agree.
Okay, so now you see all these news about the resurgence of ICE engines. There's especially one Japanese manufacturer that's always mentioned, and then you hear these rumors out of China. So the Chinese only threw us off the path of ICE engines. Now they kept developing it. What's your take on that? Is that all BS, or is it just to throw some wrenches into the system?
Look, I'll take the Chinese at their word. I think they probably have the most thermal, and I think it was what, BYD and Geely, I think are the ones arguing. They have about 46% thermodynamic efficiency, which is better than what Toyota or Hyundai have talked about. I think they're talking about 42 or 43%. But, look, as we were just talking about, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and especially extended range EVs, the EREVs, I think are going to become quite popular. EREVs represent the fastest growing segment in China right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of Western companies are looking at them, because if you go with an EREV, you have an internal combustion engine, but it operates in a fairly narrow rev range. So you can take cost out of it. You're not going to be running it up to 5, 6, 7,000 RPM. You're probably going to run it around 3,000 RPM, depending on the application. And so if you want the most efficient EREV or hybrid or plug-in hybrid, having a thermodynamic efficiency that's really good in your ICE engine counts for something. So there's still going to be more R&D going into ICE engines.
Yeah, you're exactly right there. With these range extenders, you can operate the ICE engine at its best point. It's not like driving your normal car that you have to rev from 1,000 to 6,000 to drive. You take it to its best point and then you just leave it there. Yeah.
Right. And as you know, Oliver, if you do that, it's easier to control the emissions. And by the way, you can throw away the transmission. You can throw away the drive shaft. So there's some mass and cost benefits compared to plug-in hybrids.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so my final question to round this off, John, is an observation and then a question to you. My observation is that actually for EV transition, the US has a particular competitive advantage which it can leverage. You mentioned the payback of the CO2 from the manufacturer after whatever, a small number of years. The advantage, in my view, that the US has is how far American drivers drive on average, roughly twice as far as an average European customer. So for per mile, the CO2 over the life cycle in the EV is going to be a lot lower potentially, or the rate of accumulating miles is much greater in the US. So the CO2 savings accrue much faster. So the sort of secret weapon, in a sense, is the lack of public transport in America and the fact that everyone goes everywhere in vehicles. So I'm going to ask your comment on that. But the allied question I wanted to ask that is, because EVs are so cheap to drive, the marginal cost of that extra mile is so low, Americans will be, as Europeans, will be enticed to drive even further. You'll be able to go for a couple of cents. So how's America going to deal with urban congestion? Think Los Angeles, when America is so averse to road charging, to low emission zones or congestion charges in cities. How is that, in a sense, the link between those two is how are we going to control the Americans' insatiable desire to drive when they're given the green stamp of approval of electric vehicles?
Well, the point that you bring up there, Nick, are spot on. I think, if you lower the cost of anything, you entice the consumer to use it more or buy more of it or whatever. And as the cost of transportation goes down, of course, people will be interested in driving more. There's a few offsets. You know, a lot more people are working from home right now. They're not doing their daily commute. That's not going to change. Also, we're definitely seeing a slowdown in the percentage of Americans who buy a new car every year. Now, that doesn't mean they're not buying a car, they're going to a used one instead. But I think we're going to see competing modes of mobility, getting people out of their cars. I'm talking bicycles, I'm talking, e-bikes, especially, other kinds of ride hailing, ride sharing, road taxis. Now, that doesn't answer your question exactly, but look, we've had congestion for decades. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, but I'm not convinced it's going to get worse than it is right now.
Okay, well there we go. We'll stop there on that positive view that Americans have got this competitive advantage, and it won't crucify cities in terms of congestion. So, what I would like, maybe John, we can come back to these on a future episode, as it's a very fast moving area. How these tariffs in US and in Europe as well pans out is going to be questions that would be great to discuss further. So I think we'll leave it there for today. Oliver, thank you very much indeed, as ever. But most importantly, thank you very much to John McElroy from Autoline. Really appreciate your time. And on that note, thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll join you next time. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.